Chapter 15. In the morning, the sun rose. The cricket's song gave way to a bird song, and an old woman came walking down the dirt road and tripped right over Edward. "Huh," she said. She pushed at Edward with her fishing pole. "Looks like a rabbit," she said. She put her basket down and bent down and stared at Edward. "Only he ain't real." She stood back up. "Huh," she said again. She rubbed her back. "What I say is, there's a use for everything, and everything has its use. That's what I say." Edward didn't care what she said. The terrible ache he had felt the night before had gone away, and had been replaced with a different feeling, one of emptiness and despair. "Pick me up or don't pick me up," the rabbit thought. "It makes no difference to me." The old lady picked him up. She bent him double and put him in her basket, which smelled of weeds and fish, and then she kept walking, swinging her basket and singing, "Nobody knows the troubles I've seen." Edward, in spite of himself, listened to the song. "I've seen troubles too," he thought. "You bet I have, and apparently they're not over yet." Edward was right. His troubles were not over. The old woman found a use for him. She swung him from a pole in her vegetable garden. She nailed his velvet ears to the wooden pole and spread his arms out as if he were flying, and attached his paws to the pole as if it was wrapping a piece of wire around him. In addition to Edward's, pie tins were hung from the pole, and they clinked and clanked and shone in the morning sun. "Ain't a doubt in my mind that you can scare him off." So she's made him into a scarecrow. Scare who off? Edward thought. Birds, he soon discovered, crows, and they came flying at him, cawing and screeching over his head, diving at his ears. "Go on, Clyde," the woman said. "You go act ferocious." Clyde? Edward felt a weariness so intense wash over him that he thought he might actually have to sigh. Would the world ever tire of calling him the wrong name? The old woman clapped her hands again. "Get to work, Clyde. Scare off them birds." And then she walked away from him, out of the garden, and toward the small house. There he is, being a scarecrow. The birds were insistent. They flew around his head. They tugged at the loose threads on his sweater. One large crow in particular would not leave this rabbit alone. He perched on the pole, screamed a dark message in Edward's ear, "Caw, caw, caw," without ceasing, and the sun rose higher and shone brighter. Edward became somewhat dazed. He mistook the large crow for Grandma Pellegrina. "Go ahead," he thought. "Turn me into a warthog if you want. I don't care. I'm done with caring." "Caw, caw," said the Pellegrino crow. Finally, the sun set and the birds flew away. Edward hung by his velvet ears and looked up at the night sky. He saw the stars, and for the first time in his life, he looked at them and felt no comfort. Instead, he felt made fun of. "You are down there alone," the stars seemed to say, "and we're up here all together." "I have been loved," Edward told the stars. "So," said the stars, "what difference does it make now? You're alone." Edward could think of no answer to that question. Eventually the sky lightened, the stars disappeared one by one, the birds returned, and the old woman came back to the garden. She brought a boy with her. Chapter 16. "Bryce," said the old woman, "get away from that rabbit. I ain't paying you to stand and stare." "Yes, ma'am," said Bryce. He wiped his nose with his back of his hand and continued to look up at Edward. The boy's eyes were brown with flecks of gold in them. "Hey," he whispered to Edward. A crow settled on Edward's head, and the boy flapped his arms and shouted, "Go on, get!" And the bird flew off. "Bryce," shouted the old woman. "Ma'am." "Get away from that rabbit. You do your work. I ain't going to say it again." "Yes, ma'am," said Bryce. He wiped his hand across his nose. "I'll be back to get you," he said to Edward. The rabbit spent the day hanging by his ears, baking in the hot sun, watching the old woman and Bruce weed the garden. Whenever the woman wasn't looking, Bryce raised his hand and waved at Edward. The bird circled over Edward's head, laughing at him. What was it like to have wings, Edward wondered. If he had wings when he was tossed overboard, he would have not sunk to the bottom. Instead, he would have flown in the opposite direction, up into the bright blue sky. And when Lolly took him to the dump, he would have flown out of the garbage and followed her and landed on her head, holding on with his sharp claws. And on the train, when the man kicked him, Edward would not have fallen to the ground. Instead, he would have risen up and sat on the top of the train and laughed at the man. Caw, caw, caw. In the late afternoon, Bryce and the old lady left the field. Bryce winked at Edward as he walked past him. One of the crows lighted on Edward's shoulder and tapped his beak on Edward's china face, reminding the rabbit with each tap that he had no wings, and he could not fly away, and he could not move on his own. Nighttime descended over the field, and then came a true darkness. A bird sang over and over again, "Whip-a-woo, whip-a-woo." It was the saddest sound Edward had ever heard, and then came another song, the hum of a harmonica. Bryce stepped out of the shadows. "Hey," he said to Edward. He wiped his nose with the back of his hand and then played another bit of the harmonica. "I bet you didn't think I'd come back. Well, here I am. I'm here to save you." Too late, thought Edward, as Bryce climbed the pole, worked at the wires that were tied around his wrist. "I'm nothing but an empty rabbit," he thought. Too late, thought Edward, as Bryce pulled the nails out of his ears. "I'm just a doll made of china." But when the last nail was out and he fell forward into Bryce's arms, the rabbit felt a rush of relief, and a feeling of relief was followed by one with joy. Perhaps, he thought, it's not too late for me to be saved.